Some years ago, I was involved in a project that had to do with testing some radar mechanics sometime after they had completed their 32-week Army radar maintenance instruction. Now, the testing was done on-site in their own radar equipment in their radar van, which is a large truck just filled with electronic equipment from top to bottom and from one end to the other. I would put a trouble in when he wasn't looking, and then I would point to a symptom and step aside while he tried to clear it. One of the troubles we used had to do with adjusting, just adjusting, a thing called a high-powered servo amplifier. This is a piece of equipment that occupied about a third of a cubic yard of space, not tiny. And we put a generous 10-minute time limit on the item because anybody who was good at it could do it in 1 or 2 minutes, and so we gave them a lot of time. So we would say, here, adjust the high-powered servo amplifiers, and here is your adjustment manual to help you do it. Well, it didn't work out that way. What happened was that about 45% of these people not only didn't adjust it, they couldn't even find it within 10 minutes. Why was that? Well, the instructor said, gosh, they got lots of practice in the course, but what they got was practice in walking through the wiring diagrams, practice with multiple choice questions about the theory of the thing, but they never got to touch it, and they certainly didn't get any practice in adjusting it. And the instructor said, what? But if they knew the theory, they would be able to transfer the theory to the, that doesn't work. So they got practice all right, but the practice was not relevant to what it was that they were expected to be able to do. And that's why the relevant practice description is so important. Do a good job on this module. And the relevant practice description that you're going to do takes longer to describe than to do. It's easier to do than it looks. And once you've done it 4, 5, 6 times, you won't even need the checklist. Now, the purpose of the relevant practice checklist description is twofold. First off, to remind you what it is you're going to have to provide, stuff, procedures, place, people, to give people an opportunity to practice the essence of the objective. And secondly, to tell you what you're going to have to provide to give them feedback in the practice. So, let's work through a little example and work our way through the checklist. If you'll turn to the page in your manual that has the relevant practice checklist, we can follow along together. Now, I'm going to use an objective describing a skill that you've seen performed, but maybe you haven't thought too seriously about the components of it. Here's the objective. Given a ventriloquial figure and a script, be able to act out the script. Now, look at the objective and answer the question, what will the student be doing when practicing this objective? Right, the student will be acting out a script, so in item number 1, we will write acting out a script. That's pretty straightforward. Now, look at the criteria stated in the objective and ask yourself this question. Do they talk about the performance itself or about the shape of the performance? This is a distinction that we need to talk about for a moment. There's a difference between doing something and the product of doing something. For example, writing is the performance. The finished product, what you have written on a piece of paper, is the product. The mental activity leading to the solution of a problem is the performance. The written answer is a product of the performance. It's right there and available to study. Playing music is a performance. The applause on the part of the audience is a product. Cooking is the performance, mixing it all up, toil and trouble. Actually, the dinner then or the meal itself is the product. It is there to observe, it is there to evaluate. The distinction is important because it's going to make a difference in what you have to do to provide feedback. So, back to our example. The objective says people are supposed to act out a script. Is that concerned with the performance or the shape of a performance? Yes, that's concerned with the shape of the performance. So over here, we're going to say, put a check mark in the box that says record the performance. We have to record it so that people will have something to observe while they're evaluating their performance. Next question. Under what conditions will this performance occur? In other words, what kind of stuff do we have to provide to allow the practice to happen? So you look at the objective and you find that the conditions are that there's going to be a puppet available and there's going to be a script available, and also we're going to need something with which to record the performance, preferably some videotape equipment. Now then, suppose we've done that. Next question would be, well, how could we provide students with information about whether their performance is okay or not? How could we let them know whether they're fine or not fine? Well, we could have an instructor standing there watching the performance and saying, good, that's okay, you're ready to go on to something else, or not. But what you try to do is build the criteria into the student's head so that the students can make that decisions for themselves whenever possible. So look at your checklist down here on item 4, because we're thinking now about feedback. Could we provide a description of correct responses? No, there's no right or wrong answer in this case. Suppose we modeled the desired performance. We could provide them a videotape that showed somebody doing it right. Well, it would be very difficult to make the comparison because the student doesn't know what to look for at this point. Here's what we want, a checklist of criteria or key points. So that's how we will provide feedback. We'll provide a videotape of the performance and then a checklist of things to look for, and that will allow the student to determine whether the performance is okay or not okay. Next question. Take a look at number 5. If you provided the student with that information, could you count on them to decide if their performance is okay or not? If so, go on to the next item. If not, ask yourself whether they could do that if somebody provided a comparison of the performance with the standards. If that would be the case, you'd put a check mark in that box. Next, go on to the diagnostic feedback. Up until now, we've talked about adequacy feedback, whether it's okay or not. Now, diagnostic feedback means if it's not okay, what's wrong with it? Ask yourself, if students knew that their performance was not okay, would they know what's wrong with it? If they would, as in this case, they would know what's wrong with it, so we would just circle the yes. If your answer is, well, no, I couldn't count on them to know what's wrong with the performance, then you'd ask yourself, well, suppose I provided them with some modeling, or would I have to have somebody actually do the diagnosis? If you actually need a person to do the diagnosis, then you'd put a check mark in the circle. Final question has to do with corrective feedback. If somebody knows what's wrong with their performance, will they know what to do about it? Most of the time, they will once they know what's wrong with it. But sometimes they won't. So in the case of our example, if they know what's wrong with their performance, if they knew that they were anticipating, for example, then they would know what to do about it. If they didn't, if we couldn't count on them to know what to do to fix their performance, then again we'd ask the question, suppose we modeled the performance or gave them some description of typical problems. And if that wouldn't work, then we would have to have a person, and we'd have to put a check mark in the circle. You want to try to find ways of avoiding check marks in the circle because that makes the practice more clumsy because you have to provide a live human being as part of the practice situation. So finally, just in scratch notes, put your relevant practice description together. In this case, it would look like this. Students will be videotaped as they act out a script. They're going to be given a script, a puppet, and some equipment, and then they'll be given a checklist of key points against which to check their performance. And that's all there is to it. Now, once you've used the checklist a few times, you won't need it anymore because it will all happen up here in your head. Final word, the relevant practice checklist you put together for this module are going to be used in later modules, so be sure to do a thorough job here. So go do some relevant practice descriptions.